29 minutes to 9, and you're watching the South African Morning. My name is Cindy Mabi. It's time now for our Wednesday book review. Now, much has been written about our founding president, Dr. Nelson Mandela, and his beloved wife, Winnie Mandela, an anti-apartheid activist. Now, the latest book tells the story of their marriage that spanned decades, many of which Mandela had been imprisoned. We are joined by author Johnny Steinberg to unpack his literary offering to the couple and how their marriage was all about the politics, but very intensely passionate as well. Johnny Steinberg is a multi-award winning author with the Sunday Times Ellen Payton Award. He's authored several books that speaks of the transition of South Africa and day-to-day life as well. It's really a pleasure to have you, considering you had to travel miles and miles all the way from the UK to be with us. Johnny, good morning. And give us a sense, just take us back in almost a nostalgic way of where you were when Nelson Mandela was released from prison.
Well, it was the 11th of February 1990. I was 19 years old. I was a student at Wits. And together with other students, we first went onto the streets of Johannesburg and then got in a car and went to Soweto and joined the crowds. It was an extraordinary day.
Yeah, but at that time you didn't know that you would be a multi-award winning author, and you would then have to pen stories around ordinary South Africans. The importance of that transition and how Nelson Mandela had become the father of our democracy and celebrating his life. Do you think that had inspired you from the get-go to pen these the award-winning books?
Well, my primary reason for writing this book now is the fact that Winnie Mandela and Nelson Mandela have both died, and I think that it is possible to write more freely about them as human beings, with their light and their dark, their good qualities and their bad. I think that we are now much freer to see them as people.
Yeah, and how do you then portray these colossal figures, as you're saying? Larger than life, big dreams, but also hugely flawed, and being sensitive enough that they play a very important role. You know, there's an intense love for the two protagonists. How do you find that balance?
Well, their marriage is really a dual story about two different things at the same time. On the one hand, they were both very ambitious people in the 1950s when they met. They were both very beautiful. They were very glamorous together. And they understood that their marriage could be a political tool, and they very self-consciously made it one. They wanted the story of their marriage to embody the story of their country. And it did do that in the end. And it was such a simple story. You know, the story was, here's a beautiful couple torn apart, Nelson Mandela in jail for decades. The moment this wonderful couple comes back together is the moment their people are freed. And so a story of a marriage became a story of a country, and they sold it that way, and the ANC sold it that way. And yet the reality of keeping that marriage together during the many years that they were apart is a wrenching and sad story. It's a story of cruelty. The cruelty that the apartheid regime inflicted on Winnie while she was alone is staggering to contemplate. And through all of that, they try to, you know, keeping a marriage together when you're separate is an uphill battle, and it's the most famous marriage in the world, and you've also got to manage the public side of it. It's an extraordinary story. Yeah,
and I mean, being estranged as well because of the physical incarceration of Nelson Mandela, a young, beautiful Winnie Mandela having to face her own demons and the volatile and brutal apartheid system, had almost given us a sense that when they're back together, everything, they will just pick up where they left off. It wasn't quite the case, was it?
Well, one of the things that happened while they were apart is that they grew apart politically. So by the 1980s, Nelson Mandela's greatest fear was civil war. He believed that if South Africa didn't have a peaceful negotiated settlement, it would go down in flames. Whereas Winnie Mandela believed the very opposite. She believed that unless apartheid ended violently, unless it ended through a mass insurrection, it would not end at all. And for a very long time, Nelson Mandela did not know that his wife had become his political adversary. You know, she would go and visit him month after month, year after year. It was at the very end, in the late 1980s, that he finally understood that from his own home in Soweto, she was attempting to organize what he thought would be a disaster. So in this famous marriage, polar opposites develop.
Yeah, but these weren't covert, clandestine operations she was doing. You know, was there a discussion to say, you're not the person that I fell in love with necessarily? Where is the real Nelson Mandela as a young person that, you know, Winnie would have remembered?
Oh, they were very much coverts. You know, by then she absolutely, well, you know, automatic weapons were passing through her house. It had to be covert. You know, what she was doing was very dangerous.
Yeah, there are a lot of gems, and I suppose not necessarily shocking revelations in the book for the reason to just shock or entertain, but these are true accounts of, as we were saying, human beings, but who essentially became iconic through the work and their marriage. What is it that you wanted to achieve in the book, besides portraying them as mere mortals like you and I?
Well, one of the things I wanted to achieve was to show a real irony, and a very sad irony. They wanted the story of their nation to be embodied in their marriage, and it was, but not in ways that they expected or controlled. You know, one of the things I wanted to do is show just how much both of them suffered and how much pain they went through. And in a sense, it wasn't just their suffering and pain, it was the pain of a nation. Their family was torn apart in the second half of the 20th century, and so were the South African people in many ways. And so there's this duality. It's a story of a marriage and a story of a nation, and the blood that was spilled, both in the marriage and in the nation.
Yeah, and a story of many other love interests outside of the marriage as well.
Well, you know, when Nelson Mandela went to prison, Winnie was 26 years old, and he was not coming back indefinitely, and he never expected her to remain celibate, and he said so. It was an unreasonable thing to ask of a woman who had lost her husband indefinitely and who was young. He simply asked that she be discreet and that she remain loyal to him. And in a sense, he wanted to substitute a political loyalty for a sexual loyalty, and he said so openly.
So the breakup wasn't because of, you know, extramarital.
No, the breakup was because they'd been apart for 27 years, and he remained so deeply in love with her in that time. But what he remained in love with was an image of her, a very idealized image of her as a young woman in her early 20s. She had become somebody else in the meantime. She had lived a full adult life. He hadn't been beside her with that adult life. I mean, to think that he could walk out of prison and their marriage could just resume would be, it would be a fantasy. It would be unrealistic.
Yeah, I wish we had more time, but we're going to have to leave it there. Johnny, thank you indeed. That is a multi-award-winning winner of the Sunday Times Ellen Payton Award, and the author of Winnie and Nelson, a portrait of a marriage. Johnny Steinberg joining us in studio. It is available at all good bookstores. Highly recommended read indeed.